Fort Belvedere, Surrey, December 10th, 1936. The country house stands behind stone battlements in winter stillness, its mock medieval towers visible from Windsor's Long Walk. Inside, in a ground-floor room, a fire is burning. A man sits at a mahogany desk, fountain pen in hand. He is 42 years old. He is the King of England. The document in front of him will end that. He signs. Once, twice, 3 copies, each identical. His witnesses sign beneath his name. That is the moment. 6 signatures, the scratch of pen on paper, and 327 days of kingship are over. The following evening, from Windsor Castle, he broadcasts to 12 million listeners. He chose love. He couldn't carry the burden of responsibility without the woman he loved. He wishes his brother every happiness in the task ahead. The abdication speech, partly drafted with Winston Churchill's assistance, hits every emotional note with the precision of a man who understood his audience, even as he abandoned them. Britain has always told this story as a tragedy, a romantic king, an impossible love, the scheming American divorcee who broke the monarchy. For decades, Wallis Simpson absorbed the public's need for a villain, and the history books let her carry it. Britain dodged a bullet that December evening, and most people have never stopped to ask what the bullet actually was. The answer is in documents the British government spent 12 years trying to suppress. Edward VIII was a weak, narcissistic Nazi sympathizer whose removal from the throne was Britain's luckiest break of the 20th century. The abdication wasn't a constitutional scandal, it was an eviction. And Wallis Simpson, whatever her considerable flaws, was the inadvertent instrument of it. That's the verdict. Here is the evidence. Edward, Albert, Christian, George, Andrew, Patrick, David, his family called him David, was born in 1894, eldest son of George V. He became Prince of Wales in 1910 and spent the next 2.5 decades becoming one of the most photographed and discussed men in the world. He was charming, genuinely popular with working people in a way that baffled the patrician establishment, and fluent in German. He referred to it in his memoirs as the Muttersprache of many of our relations, which was accurate. The royal family's Germanic roots ran deep, and Edward felt them as an attachment rather than an embarrassment. He'd toured Germany twice before the First World War. His friend and conservative MP Chips Channon noted in his diary in 1936 that Edward was going the dictator way and is pro-German. Channon wrote that privately. He became king on January 20th, 1936, after the death of his father, George V. The constitutional problem he brought with him was straightforward and fatal. Wallis Simpson had been divorced twice, and both former husbands were still living. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, which prohibited divorced persons from remarrying while a former spouse lived, Edward couldn't marry her and remain on the throne. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin told him exactly that on November 16th. Parliament wouldn't pass legislation enabling a morganatic marriage. The Dominions wouldn't sanction her as queen consort. Edward's choice was binary. He made it in under 4 weeks. He signed the instrument of abdication on December 10th. His brother Albert became George VI. Edward became the Duke of Windsor. His crisis, the establishment hoped, was over. It had barely begun. By 1935, before the abdication, before any public crisis, Joachim von Ribbentrop, then serving as German ambassador to Britain, was reporting directly to Adolf Hitler that Edward was very friendly to Germany. These were filed diplomatic cables transmitted through official German channels to Berlin. Ribbentrop subsequently embedded in Hitler's thinking a specific explanation for the abdication, that the former king had lost his throne precisely because of his pro-German sympathies. Hitler accepted that explanation completely. It would shape everything that followed. Edward married Wallis in June 1937 at the Château de Condé in France, a property loaned to them by Charles Badeau, a businessman with extensive ties to the Nazi industrial apparatus. After a honeymoon in Vienna, they established themselves in Paris. That September, Edward announced his intention to tour Germany to study housing and working conditions. The British government was appalled. George VI, through Edward's advisor, Walter Monckton, described the planned visit in a letter as a bombshell and a bad one. The Foreign Office warned the Duke that the Nazis were propaganda experts. The British Embassy in Berlin informed Edward's party that it wouldn't be available to assist them formally in the course of their visit. Edward promised to keep a low profile and restrict himself to private observations. He didn't keep a low profile. The Windsors arrived at Berlin's Friedrichstrasse station on the morning of October 11, 1937, to a crowd of approximately 2,000 people and a welcoming delegation that included Ribbentrop himself. The German media had been primed for weeks. The Duchess was dressed in royal blue, described by scholar Susanna de Vries as having covered herself in jewels and doing her best to look suitably royal. Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, kissed her hand at the station platform and addressed her as Your Highness, a title the British royal family had explicitly refused her. The couple were driven at speed through crowded streets in a Mercedes to the Kaiserhof Hotel, while German cameras documented every movement. What followed, over 12 days, was a systematic tour of the new Germany as its government wanted it seen. They visited factories, many of them producing material for Germany's rearmament effort, though this wasn't presented to the Windsors as such. Edward inspected German troops. They dined with Joseph Goebbels, Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Albert Speer. The Duchess took afternoon tea with Rudolf Hess. Edward reportedly visited a concentration camp during the tour. The guard towers, according to subsequent accounts, were explained to him as facilities for storing meat. Whether he accepted that explanation or simply didn't pursue the question, the record does not say. Both possibilities are damning in different ways. On October 22nd, at the Berghof in Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, Edward met the Führer for approximately 2 hours. Interpreter Paul Schmidt was present. The minutes of that meeting were lost, almost certainly destroyed, during the war. Schmidt later wrote that in their conversations, he could see nothing whatever to indicate whether the Duke of Windsor really sympathized with the ideology and practices of the Third Reich. His observation covers him professionally. It doesn't cover Edward. During the visit, Edward gave Nazi salutes, including when inspecting an SS honor guard. The photographs exist. As historian Andrew Roberts has characterized it, the German government believed Edward had been forced to abdicate because of his pro-German views, which is precisely why they treated the visit as a de facto royal progress. They weren't hosting a neutral observer. They were hosting a man they considered, on the strength of Ribbentrop's reports, a documented asset. Hitler's conclusion from the meeting was recorded by Albert Speer. I am certain through him, permanent friendly relations could have been achieved. If he had stayed, everything would have been different. Goebbels put it more simply in his diary. It's a shame he is no longer king. Edward's post-war account maintained that Hitler had struck him as a somewhat ridiculous figure with his theatrical posturings and his bombastic pretensions, and that he hadn't discussed politics. The Nazis drew the opposite conclusion from the same meeting, and in 1940, they built an entire intelligence operation around that conclusion. In 1966, nearly 3 decades after the visit, Edward told an interviewer that the tour had confirmed for him that Red Russia was the only enemy, and that Great Britain and all of Europe had an interest in encouraging Germany to march against the East and to crush communism once and for all. This wasn't a man temporarily dazzled by Nazi pageantry. It was a consistent ideological worldview, expressed decades apart, across vastly different circumstances, by the same man. Viscount Caldecott, a cabinet member, summarized the British government's internal assessment in 1940 with characteristic directness. The Duke is well known to be pro-Nazi, and he may become a center of intrigue. That was an understatement, and everyone involved knew it. May 1940. France fell in 36 days. Edward, serving as a British military liaison officer attached to the French Army High Command, had spent the preceding months filing intelligence assessments of French defenses, including a comprehensive and accurate account of French military unpreparedness and the specific weaknesses of the Maginot Line. Those assessments were largely ignored by British intelligence. When France collapsed, Edward fled with Wallis through Biarritz to neutral Spain and then on to Portugal. He arrived in Lisbon carrying that institutional knowledge and checked into the villa of Ricardo Espírito Santo Silva, a Portuguese banker described by British intelligence as very pro-German, and he stayed there for weeks, while Churchill sent increasingly impatient telegrams ordering him back to Britain. Churchill reminded him that as a major general, he was subject to military authority, and that refusal to comply with orders could constitute grounds for a court-martial. Edward stayed. He met with Spanish Foreign Minister Colonel Juan Belvedere y Atienza, where, according to subsequent diplomatic cables, he criticized Churchill and expressed antagonism toward the British royal family over their treatment of Wallis. Then, Spanish diplomat Don Javier Bermejillo filed his report. On June 25, 1940, Bermejillo recorded a conversation with Edward in which the Duke stressed if one bombed England effectively, this could bring peace. Bermejillo concluded that Windsor seemed very much to hope that this would occur. The same report noted Edward blaming the Jews, the Reds, and the Foreign Office for the war. These are archived diplomatic records, not retrospective allegations. Filed state documents, transmitted through official channels to Madrid and subsequently forwarded to German officials, preserved in multiple national archives. The report also noted, as corroboration, that Edward had been making similar anti-Semitic remarks long before he became king in 1936. Here is the situation plainly stated. A man holding the temporary rank of Major General in the British Army in June 1940 was expressing to a foreign diplomat the private hope that German bombing would force his own government to surrender. That same government was simultaneously ordering him back to Britain. He was staying, voluntarily, in the household of a man British intelligence had flagged as pro-German. Historian Andrew Lowney, whose 2022 book, Traitor, King, is the most comprehensive modern prosecution of Edward's wartime record, states the conclusion without qualification. Edward's activities in Spain and Portugal in 1940 amounted to treason. Lowney further documents that Edward became convinced that Great Britain couldn't defeat Germany in a war, and believed the British were best served by reconciling with the Nazi regime, and that, in his private conversations, he directly contradicted the foreign policy of his own government. The Nazis knew his position. In July 1940, they moved to exploit it. Operation Willy, Unternehmen Willy, was Hitler's personal project. He ordered it on July 23, 1940. Walter Schellenberg, the 30-year-old SS counterintelligence chief who'd already won the Iron Cross for his role in the Venlo incident the previous year, was appointed to run it. The operation was conducted by the SS Sicherheitsdienst, not the Abwehr, as is sometimes claimed, meaning Schellenberg answered directly to Himmler. Ribbentrop served as intermediary between Hitler and the operation's mechanics. 50 million Swiss francs were reportedly set aside to maintain the Duke in appropriate style if he came to Spain, You don't commit 50 million Swiss francs to a long shot. The plan had two tracks. Track 1, persuade Edward to broker a negotiated peace ending the war on German terms. Track 2, if Britain was conquered, restore Edward to the throne as a puppet king, a compliant monarch for a Nazi-occupied Britain. Ribbentrop had convinced Hitler that Edward lost his throne because of his pro-German sympathies, and Hitler built an intelligence operation on that premise. Schellenberg flew from Berlin to Madrid, conferred with German ambassador Eberhard von Stohr, and proceeded to Lisbon. A Spanish friend of the Duke, Miguel Primo de Rivera, son of a former Spanish dictator, leader of the Falange, was flown to Lisbon on July 16th to make the first formal approach. The offer was framed as an invitation for a hunting trip in Spain, with financial assistance and accommodations befitting Edward's station. According to the diplomatic cables filed afterward, Edward was receptive to the offer, but expressed reservations, citing the telegrams from the British government ordering him to the Bahamas. A second approach on July 22nd produced similarly equivocal results. Schellenberg, working from the villa's perimeter, ran a series of psychological pressure operations designed to convince the Windsors that British intelligence posed an imminent threat to their lives. His agents threw stones against the windows of the Espirito Santo villa at night, then circulated rumors among the household staff that British operatives were responsible. A bouquet of flowers was delivered to the Duchess with a note warning her of the machinations of the British intelligence service. A further scare tactic, a plan to fire shots into the windows, was scheduled for July 30th and then cancelled. Schellenberg's recorded reason for the cancellation was concern about possible psychological effects on the Duchess. The Duchess of Windsor's psychological state was, apparently, a tactical variable in an SS counterintelligence operation. It wasn't working fast enough. By July 29th, Schellenberg's logs recorded 3 words in German. Willi will nicht. Willi doesn't want to go. Edward's resistance had firmed. But resistance isn't the same as rejection, and the documents recording his responses describe a man who engaged with the offers long enough to give Berlin encouragement across multiple weeks and multiple contacts, not a man who refused from the outset. The Marburg files contain a Nazi telegram recording what happened when German agents specifically raised the possibility of Edward's restoration to the British throne. The telegram reads, "Both seem to be completely bound up in formalistic ways of thought, since they replied that, according to the British Constitution, this wasn't possible after abdication." When the agent then remarked, "The course of war may produce changes, even in the British Constitution," the Duchess, in particular, became very thoughtful. Wallis grew thoughtful. The Nazis noted this specifically and filed it to Berlin. Sir Walter Monckton, Edward's lawyer and trusted advisor, described in the Operation Willi documents themselves as an old friend of the Duke, arrived in Lisbon around July 30th, dispatched by Churchill to accelerate the Windsors' departure. On August 1st, Edward and Wallis sailed from Lisbon aboard the liner Excalibur, bound for Nassau. The automobile carrying the ducal luggage had been sabotaged, according to Schellenberg's logs, so the bags arrived at the port late. A bomb threat on the Excalibur caused additional delays while Portuguese officials searched the ship. The Nazis used everything available to keep Edward in Europe for a few more days. Churchill had appointed Edward governor of the Bahamas. Royal historian Carolyn Harris confirms it was a means of removing him from Europe because his ties with the Nazis made him a liability. The governor's mansion in Nassau was the most comfortable quarantine Britain could arrange for a former king. Then came the Marburg files, and the establishment's sustained effort to ensure nobody ever read them. American troops advancing through Germany in May 1945 found over 400 tons of Nazi foreign ministry documents near Marburg Castle. First Lieutenant David Silberberg initially discovered papers signed by Ribbentrop near the Degenershausen estate and returned to investigate further. Karl von Loesch, an assistant to Hitler's personal translator Paul Otto Schmidt, had been retreating near Eisenach when American troops arrested him. Schmidt had ordered von Loesch to destroy all the top-secret papers in the archives. Von Loesch had destroyed most of them. He hadn't destroyed all. When arrested, he offered to lead intelligence officers to correspondence he'd buried in the grounds near the outskirts of Marburg in exchange for immunity from prosecution. They dug them up. Among the exhumed documents, within what became known as the Windsor file, were at least 60 pieces of correspondence, letters, telegrams, internal memoranda relating to the Duke of Windsor and his wartime relationship with the German High Command. The most damaging, by multiple accounts, were communications alleged to confirm that Edward had encouraged continued bombing of Britain as a mechanism for forcing peace negotiations. The documents were sent to London. Winston Churchill reviewed them with King George VI. George VI insisted they be suppressed and never released to the public. Churchill went further. He personally pleaded with Eisenhower to keep the Windsor section locked away for at least 10 or 20 years. He wanted, according to multiple sources, to destroy all traces of the relevant Nazi telegrams entirely. Eisenhower declined to go that far, but accepted the delay. The Foreign Office file reference is FO 1093/23, Activities of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor regarding appeasement of the Nazis, 1940, held at the National Archives in Kew. The entire collection was transported to Wadden Hall, Buckinghamshire, in 1948, where it sat for nearly a decade. Churchill's private characterization was that the documents were tendentious and unreliable, and that he feared publication would suggest the Duke was in close touch with German agents. His concern was accurate. That is exactly what the documents demonstrated, and he knew it because he'd read them. They were released in 1957, 12 years after discovery, fitting neatly within Churchill's requested suppression window. Edward's immediate response was to call the entire contents complete fabrications. Buckingham Palace's statement said he had never wavered in his loyalty to the British cause, and that German records are necessarily a much tainted source. A fair point about German records. It applies less forcefully to Spanish diplomatic cables, which corroborate the same pattern independently. The Bermejillo reports are Spanish state documents. The German records and the Spanish records describe the same man expressing the same views through the same period. The convergence isn't coincidence. Imagine May 1940, with Edward still on the throne. Churchill wants to fight. The Nazis are at the Channel. France has fallen in a month. The question facing Britain is binary and existential. Resist or negotiate? Churchill's answer is resistance. Parliament's answer, after debate, is resistance. George VI's answer is resistance. And the symbolic weight of the monarchy in wartime Britain wasn't trivial. Now, place Edward on that throne. He had told a Spanish diplomat weeks into the war that bombing England effectively could bring peace, and that he hoped it would. He believed Britain couldn't win. He believed the best outcome was reconciliation with the Nazi regime. He was known to German intelligence as a sympathizer, reliable enough to justify a major, dedicated operation and 50 million Swiss francs. Hitler himself had stated that through Edward, permanent friendly relations could have been achieved. The British constitutional monarchy had limited formal power by 1939. Parliament and the Prime Minister could have managed an uncooperative king legislatively. But a king who leaked assessments of British military thinking to pro-German contacts, who undermined public confidence in the resistance strategy, who served as a living propaganda asset for German broadcasts, not because he could veto Churchill's war strategy, but because he was, in Caldecote's exact words, a center of intrigue with documented channels to the enemy. That king would have been catastrophic. And that king was one unsigned document away from remaining in place. The man who actually sat on the throne during those years was George VI, Albert Frederick Arthur George, Bertie to his family. He was 40 years old on the day Edward signed the abdication papers. He'd spent most of his life without expectation of the crown. Born, not heir apparent, but well down the line of succession. A man whose professional life had been built around the assumption that his older brother would reign. He wasn't prepared. He knew it. The severe stammer he'd battled since childhood, worked on for years with speech therapist Lionel Logue, was a physical manifestation of the anxiety that public duty triggered in him, and the war required him to address his nation constantly. Every broadcast cost him something real. He stayed. When the Blitz began in September 1940 and evacuation plans were drawn up, George VI and Queen Elizabeth refused to leave London. They remained in the capital through German bombing that hit Buckingham Palace itself 9 times. They walked through rubble in the East End and stood in front of destroyed houses alongside their subjects. After one raid hit the palace courtyard, Queen Elizabeth said she could finally look the East End in the face. That was the wartime monarchy, present, visible, refusing to go anywhere. The symbolic anchor held, in part, because the man wearing the crown had decided that holding it was worth more than protecting himself. While George VI endured the Blitz in London, Edward was governor of the Bahamas. He was a heavy smoker from early life, and the combined weight of an unexpected crown, a world war he'd been given no preparation to lead, and years of cigarettes compressed his life ruthlessly. In September 1951, doctors removed his left lung. The condition was described in official communications as structural abnormalities. It was lung cancer. On February 6, 1952, George VI died at Sandringham. He was 56 years old. Oxford academic Richard Dahl demonstrated 2 years after the king's death that lifelong smoking reduced life expectancy by approximately 10 years. The medical assessment was stark. If the king had not smoked, he might have lived another 10 years. But the cigarettes were compounded by a burden nobody had designed him to carry, and which he carried because duty demanded it. He was broken by it because his brother abandoned it. One brother, unprepared, stammering, worn to his death by a war and a crown he'd inherited from a traitor. He stood in the rubble. He raised a queen. The other, charming, German fluent, convinced Britain couldn't win, governed Nassau and waited to see how the war turned out. The human cost of Edward's treachery was George VI's life, cut short by a decade. That isn't sentiment. It's consequence. Now, Wallis Simpson. She was no saint. Contemporaneous accounts are consistent on her character: domineering, controlling, sharp-tongued, relentlessly focused on her own comfort and status. Government documents suggest Edward needed someone to control him, and that Wallis fulfilled that function. One document notes she satisfied the king's need to be dominated. One intelligence file called her directly a scheming woman. FBI records monitored her throughout the wartime period and concluded she had Nazi sympathies. Her social connections after the abdication ran through compromised circles. She and Edward maintained ties with various Nazi-adjacent figures and sympathizers. The rumor of a romantic relationship between Wallis and Ribbentrop during his mid-1930s London posting appears in multiple biographies and intelligence files, with officers reportedly told von Ribbentrop had been the Duchess's lover. No primary document confirms it. It belongs in the category of documented rumor, noted, not established. What the evidence does establish is sustained social proximity to the Nazi apparatus and a striking absence of ideological resistance to it. The Marburg Files telegram recording Wallis growing very thoughtful when a German agent raised Edward's possible restoration to the throne tells you something about how she was calculating the angles. That's not heroism. It isn't neutrality. It's ambition encountering an opportunity and pausing to think. But here is where the title of this documentary earns its keep. Not intentionally, not heroically, not with any awareness that she was doing something useful for anyone other than herself. Wallis Simpson was a twice-divorced American woman from Baltimore who wanted to marry a king. Her existence as the object of Edward's obsession created the constitutional impossibility that removed him from power. Without Wallis, Edward stays on the throne. Without the constitutional crisis of December 1936, Britain enters the Second World War with a king who privately hoped German bombing would force a settlement, whose sympathies were documented in German foreign ministry cables, and whom the Nazis were prepared to spend 50 million Swiss francs to recruit as a puppet. She wanted to marry him. She got rid of him. Britain survived its darkest hour with a king who was actually committed to winning it. History cast Wallis as the woman who broke the monarchy. The evidence suggests she inadvertently preserved it. She is buried at Windsor, in the royal mausoleum of the family that spent decades vilifying her, beside the man whose removal from power was Britain's luckiest accident of the century. That is either a magnificent irony or the most appropriate outcome history could have arranged. Edward's case is remarkable in part because it isn't an anomaly. The institution has a recurring tendency, call it royal rot, to produce members who prioritize personal interest, personal grievance, or personal celebrity over the obligations placed on them, then collide with the consequences at significant public cost. Prince Andrew, Edward's nephew, spent years cultivating a friendship with Jeffrey Epstein that should have triggered immediate concerns about judgment, security exposure, and institutional risk at every level. When the relationship became impossible to manage quietly, Andrew gave a BBC Newsnight interview in November 2019 intended as controlled transparency. It became something else entirely. The absence of sweat cited as an alibi, the Pizza Express dinner in Woking produced as a character witness, a man deploying the vocabulary of innocent explanation with a complete absence of the affect that accompanies it. Andrew was stripped of his military titles and royal patronages in January 2022. The institution moved quietly to contain the damage and hoped the matter would settle. Charles, now King Charles III, spent decades as the Prince of Wales making interventions in planning decisions and alternative medicine that required Buckingham Palace to issue careful clarificatory statements. His private letters to government ministers, released through Freedom of Information proceedings and dubbed the Black Spider Memos, showed a prince who understood the constitutional prohibition on royal political interference and was operating near its edges regardless. The distance from Edward's documented treachery is vast. The structural instinct, the institution's rules as constraints to be managed rather than commitments to be honored, has a family resemblance. Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties in January 2020, followed by the Oprah Winfrey interview in March 2021, produced a portrait of the institution that was devastating in its specifics and contested in its implications. 12 million people watched Edward's 1970 BBC interview with Kenneth Harris, in which the Duke said he'd never felt he belonged to the establishment because of his independent nature and had collided with it. A comparable UK audience watched the Oprah broadcast. The parallel both audiences sensed wasn't coincidence. It was structural recurrence. the royal who felt wronged by the institution, who went outside it to make their case publicly, who traded the protection of the crown for the freedom to speak. Edward did it in 1970. Harry and Meghan did it in 2021. The members who cause the most damage tend to share a profile: charm that outruns judgment, a sense of personal grievance that makes them exploitable by external actors, and a settled conviction that the rules were designed for the institution rather than for them. Edward had all three in concentrated form. Andrew had two. Harry has a version of the third. The institution keeps generating this combination, and it keeps expressing surprise when the consequences arrive. That pattern isn't bad luck. It's institutional character expressing itself generationally. In Edward's case, the catastrophe was averted. Churchill supported him during the abdication crisis, a position the parliamentary record notes earned Churchill little respect amongst his fellow MPs. Baldwin managed the constitutional machinery competently, but his goal was an orderly exit, not a reckoning with what Edward actually represented. Nobody in December 1936 was laying out the full prosecution case. They were trying to get through a constitutional crisis without destroying the monarchy in the process. The disaster was averted because Edward VIII fell completely, and perhaps irrationally, in love with a woman the British Constitution couldn't accommodate. He lived until 1972. Had he not abdicated, that is how long he would have reigned. Through the entirety of the Second World War, through Nuremberg, through the Atomic Age, through Suez, through the entire first quarter-century of the Cold War. The Marburg files offer a partial picture of what that reign might have looked like. Churchill suppressed them for 12 years because the truth was too damaging to release. George VI insisted they be withheld from the public. The British establishment understood, even if they couldn't say it plainly, that they had narrowly escaped an outcome the documents describe in considerable detail. Edward is buried at Windsor. Wallis, who died in 1986, is buried beside him, in the royal mausoleum of the monarchy she'd inadvertently helped preserve. History spent decades casting her as the woman who broke the British crown. She ended up interred inside it. The verdict the evidence supports is this: Edward VIII was a traitor in documented wartime statement, in the sympathies he expressed to foreign officials while serving as a British officer, and in the use the Nazi intelligence apparatus was prepared to make of him. The Nazis built an entire operation around him because they believed those sympathies were real and reliable. Churchill suppressed the government documents for 12 years because the truth was too damaging to release. He was removed from the throne not by statesmanship, but by his own obstinate obsession with a woman the Constitution wouldn't accept. She wanted to marry him. She got rid of him. History sometimes gets saved not by heroes, but by accidents. Subscribe for more stories like this.